The Honourable David Parker.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I rise to take a call on part two also. Could I move to a topic that I don't think has been addressed yet on part two, which relates to the ability of the Minister under Clause 20 of the Bill to request the Financial Market Authority to inquire into an issue that's of concern to the Minister. The Minister under Clause 20 may, by notice to the Financial Markets Authority, request that the Financial Market Authority inquire into and report on any matter relating to financial markets, financial market participants or other persons engaged in conduct relating to those markets. And I want to just explore that a little and to inquire of the Minister and the Chair as to whether these are the sorts of issues that are being talked of. I think it was evident to quite a few people in New Zealand and quite a few people in Parliament that there were problems afoot as a consequence of the property bubble that developed around the world. There was a property bubble that was inflated during the heady days when credit was easy in various parts of the world, and we weren't immune from it. Actually, we were one of the worst in the world, but we weren't the worst. The government of the day, which was a Labour government, pushed against it in a number of ways. We actually tried to take the heat out of it a little bit by increasing interest rates through the Reserve Bank, which they do independently. We also took the heat out of it by running government surpluses, and so that the government was saving money and effectively taking money out of the economy that would otherwise have further inflated that property bubble. And I suppose at that juncture I should put on record that, of course, every one of those budgets that we ran as a surplus, the national government then complained that the nation... No, I said that through the independent Reserve Bank. No, the government didn't. No, I thought I had... Yeah. But what we did do is we ran surpluses that were opposed by Mr Williamson and everyone else on the Labour government and on the national opposition. They said we were being greedy and it should have gone back in tax cuts. Of course, if we had done that, not only would we have had bigger problems in the finance companies, we would also have had a government balance sheet that was terrible, and we would be like the so-called pigs, Portugal, Ireland, Greece and Spain, where they've got such high levels of government debt they're really in the mire. So we didn't do that. And the third way that we pushed against it was by introducing Kiwisaver, which introduced private savings. But nonetheless, it is true that despite all of those problems, there was all of those measures, there was a property bubble in New Zealand, and one of the symptoms of that property bubble was excessive lending into some risky propositions by finance companies. And that was evident for some time before the crash. There were warnings that were coming from the Governor of the Reserve Bank, and there were warnings from various other commentators. Of course, there were some self-interested people in the property sector, including a number of real estate agents who, of course, said there was nothing to worry about, and the finance companies themselves presented a very rosy picture of the future in a way that understated the risk that was out there. Now, I think it would have been good if we had had this power at that time for the Minister to say, hey, look, we want to have a look a bit deeper into some of these things, because I think that it was evident to a number of people that there were related party transactions that were of concern that were proliferating in the finance sector. And by that I mean transactions where the people who were ostensibly acting as independent managers of finance companies trying to lend money for the benefit of the finance company in a way that returned interest to the people who were investing in the finance company through debenture stock. They were presenting themselves in a way which was, in my view, dishonest. They were effectively saying, look, we're not self-interested in these things, when we now know that a lot of them had loans from the finance company using the money that people had deposited into the finance companies, and they were using those monies to lend into ventures that were highly speculative and in which they or members of their family or related family trusts had an interest. And those related party transactions were not properly disclosed, and I would like to see that sort of issue inquired into at the time, or indeed even now, because there is a systemic issue here as to why it was that this wasn't picked up by some of Mr. Chairman.
I call the Honourable David Parker.
There's a systemic issue. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. There's a systemic issue as to why that wasn't picked up by the people who already had statutory obligations to supervise these organisations. Finance companies always have a debenture trust deed. In respect of that debenture trust deed, there is always a statutory supervisor. The statutory supervisor is generally a trustee company, and it is one of the roles of that statutory supervisor to supervise the conduct of the finance company under that deed of trust that governs the term of their debenture stock. So I think that's an area where that could be used. I would be interested in Minister another one. The accounting standards that we have, I don't know what other people in this House think, but I think that some of our accounting standards have become so hideously complex that even people who have got a degree in accountancy, and I have, find that you struggle to read them. You struggle to read them. And they've become so complex they no longer make common sense to people, and therefore people don't bother to read them properly, or in fact most people can't read them properly, and even those who could read them don't bother to go to that trouble because you have to spend a day to do it or half a day to do it to get to the bottom of it. Not only that, but as my colleague Charles Chevelle just said, they've become instruments in sort of tick box compliance rather than fair provision of information to people who are making an investment decision. And so although they've become more complex, they've actually become less useful. They've also driven up compliance costs. The costs, they're no cheaper. In fact, accounting costs and audit costs that relate, the audit of those practices as well has become, in some cases, hideously expensive. And so the added complexity, one, didn't protect people, two, has become more expensive, and three, doesn't serve the purpose for which it was originally intended. And I would like to see, we hear lots of people, and I must say I get a bit tired of the accountants in society calling forever when they're asked for a comment from the newspaper for a reduction in compliance costs, when in actual fact they're actually perhaps one of the centres of greatest compliance cost in our economy. And I would attest to that both from some of my own private experience, both in respect of the cost of putting together prospectuses now and the costs of audits and accounting fees as the increasingly complex accounting standards take longer and longer for people to comply with. So there's a need for an inquiry and a report into that as to how we can appropriately provide realistic information. We went the wrong way with investment statements. Investment statements dumbed things down, and anyone with a bit of knowledge actually went to the prospectus anyway, but we've gone, in the prospectus itself, we've gone far the other way, so that we've ended up with some very complex things that no one reads, or few people read, few people understand, and some other documents that we had with investment statements that were too superficial. Third thing that I would suggest, Mr. Chairman, that we have a look into, and that's actually how these rules have been applied in practice. And this is something I might come back to in a later call if I have the opportunity. I don't have the time to finish it this time, Mr. Chairman. And that relates to how organisations that wanted to make due provision for risk, which was inherent somewhere in an investment portfolio, effectively being stopped by the trustees and the auditors from doing so. And what used to happen was that if you wanted to make a provision for what effectively you would call a doubtful debt, you couldn't do it because the trustee would say, oh, well, you haven't got a debt that's provable yet because you can't get a loss that's provable yet. We can't point to a particular loss. Therefore, if you're making a provision for a doubtful debt, you're actually effectively keeping capital back from the people who it should be distributed to, and we're going to force you to revalue your unit up. So if you've made an allowance for an inherent but unspecified liability in the investment portfolio of a finance company or an investment trust or a mortgage trust, the auditors came along and said, oh, now you've got to put the price up to $1.10 instead of $1. Well, that actually completely defeated the purpose of the provision for doubtful debt that you were trying to create. And that remains a very, very real problem because it was an absolute disincentive to people acting prudently, and that was caused, again, by the people who were meant to be protecting the interests of the depositors, and it was unworldly, I would say, but it happened on more than one occasion, and that sort of thing should be inquired into. That's the sort of thing that the Financial Markets Authority can help with, and I would be interested to see from the Minister as to whether he supports that.
I call the